Hey everyone, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Sigrid, an Musume who deals huge damage through powerful combos and held basics. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, wenjins, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information that will be shown is from the creator experience server, so things can still change when her banner drops. Let's start by first talking about her unbridled spear attacks and aerial patrol state. Now, several of her attacks are counted as unbridled spear attacks, namely her BA4, 2 EX specials, dodge counter, chain attack, assist follow-up, and finally her ult. So basically, most of her kit. But whenever one of these attacks hits an enemy, she enters or refreshes the aerial patrol spear state, and gains one use of her held basic attack. But you can only have one held basic use active at a time. Now during her aerial patrol state, it gives her access to her stronger EX special and held basic. Plus, if she hits a stunned enemy, their stun damage multiplier is increased by 20%. But the more important thing is that it also gives her a 66% crit rate buff for 8 seconds, which can be extended by up to 40 seconds just by activating or refreshing her aerial patrol state. Just note, aerial patrol's timer is indicated by her decreasing bar, and the uses and level of her held basic attack is indicated by the 3 dots. But speaking of which, her aerial patrol state's duration heavily depends on the level of her held basic, with it going from 8 seconds at level 1 all the way down to 6 seconds with a level 3 held basic. And when she exits the state, it lowers the level of her held basic attack. But it is entirely possible to keep full uptime of aerial patrol since its duration pauses when Sigrid is off-field, and you can easily refresh the state with her unbridled spear attacks. But with her core passive out of the way, we can finally look at her abilities, starting with her regular basic, which is your fairly standard basic attack combo string. But you will be using this ability a lot since a lot of her abilities combo into it. And it is an unbridled spear attack, so it easily refreshes her aerial patrol while giving her one held basic use. Speaking of which, we can now look at her held basic. And like I said earlier, in order to use this attack, Sigrid does need to be in the aerial patrol state, and she needs to have one held basic use currently active. Basically, you can use it if her bar is glowing blue while one of its dots are blinking. If they are not, then it means you can't use the attack. But moving on, this attack has 3 levels, again indicated by the number of dots in her bar, with each use of her held basic leveling it up by 1, and each level of course makes her held basic significantly stronger, as you can see with the higher multipliers at the bottom of the screen. Now, if you use the level 3 version of the skill, sadly instead of remaining at level 3, it actually resets the level back to 1. But it is worth noting that you can block attacks with her level 1 or 2 held basic. And if you do, not only does it negate the damage, the next held basic also deals 100% more days, her held basic levels up, aerial patrol is refreshed, and she gains one use of her held basic. After which, you can press basic attack again to use another held basic. Other than that though, her held basic also has one other mechanic. If it is used right after her regular basic attack, she retains its current stage. Meaning, if you use her held basic right after her BA3, it allows you to combo directly into her BA4. But moving on, she has 2 EX specials, one for her aerial patrol state and one for when it's not active, and both attacks are considered as unbridled spear attacks. Her first one, Scattered Jade, is only usable if her aerial patrol state is inactive. But since it is an unbridled spear attack, it does activate her special state. However, this attack is significantly weaker than her second EX special, so as much as possible, you don't want to use it. While her second EX special is Shattered Jade, which is only usable during her aerial patrol state. And it is significantly stronger, having a 1200% higher multiplier than her first EX special. Now the neat thing is, her 2 EX specials also have the same mechanic as her held basic, wherein if they are used after one of her regular basic attacks, she retains its current stage, which again is neat for combos. Now, it's also worth noting that her assist follow-up and dodge counter are also unbridled spear attacks. But the neat thing is, her dodge counter also has the same mechanic as her held basic and EX special, wherein it retains the stage of her regular basic attack as long as it is used after it. Moving on to her ult, which is her fairly standard high damage AoE ult, and yes, this is also an unbridled spear attack, so it does recover one held basic use, making it a neat finisher for combos during stuns. As for her chain attack, well, aside from the normal chain attack mechanics, it is also an unbridled spear attack, and it has two very important features. First of all, each time it is used, it grants her the tempered buff, which increases the damage of her held basics by 20% for a refreshable 50-second duration. But as for its second unique mechanic, when Sigrid is in the aerial patrol state and her chain attack hits a stunned enemy for the first time, she enters the formation breaker state. Now this state first records the current level of her held basics before resetting it. Then by holding basic attack, it allows you to use each level of her held basic once as part of a 3-part combo. After which, she exits formation breaker and sets her held basic level to the level it was before she entered the state. Now this of course is neat for dealing lots of damage during stuns. But the cool thing is, held basics used within this state cannot trigger chain attacks. Meaning, you can use it between chain attacks, then switch out during her held basic level 3 to trigger Sigrid's chain attack with another character to follow up into a held basic to maximize Sigrid's damage during a stun. Now sadly, unless you have her M6, you can only trigger Formation Breaker once per stun. And finally, for her additional ability, which needs a stun or support character to activate, with it increasing her damage against enemies in the contamination state by 15%, but aside from this, it gives her a 120 attack buff that increases by 12 for each of her character levels, giving up to a max 840 attack buff at level 60 as long as her additional ability is active. As for her talent Prio, level up her core skill in basics first to get her maximum crit rate buff and to maximize her held basic damage. Then level up her ult and EX special since you do use them a lot. Then finally, level up her assists and her dodge. But with her kit out of the way, let's talk about her Mindscapes. Her M1 gives a 25% attack buff just by having it active. Aside from this, it essentially turns her held basic level 3 into an unbridled spear attack, allowing it to activate her aerial patrol state and regen one activation use for her held basic. This essentially allows you to combo into a level 1 held basic right after using its level 3 variation. And finally, when her held basics activation count exceeds the 1 activation limit of her held basics, the next held basic will deal an additional hit of ice damage. While her M2 increases the pen ratio of her unbridled spear attacks and held basic by 24%. Which is insane since that's all of the abilities you use with her, and this is especially good when you pair her with other pen ratio sources like the newly buffed Rena. Aside from this, it also extends the duration of the aerial patrol state by 2 seconds. And finally, it increases her overall decibel generation rate by 10%. As for her M4, it allows her aerial patrol state to give an 18% damage buff. This buff also follows the same mechanics as her crit rate buff, wherein it initially lasts for 8 seconds, but it can be extended by up to 40 seconds by constantly reactivating her aerial patrol state. And finally, for her M6, it enables her held basic to deal an additional hit of ice damage, with the strength of the hit getting stronger per each level of her held basic. Aside from this, the held basics from Formation Breaker will now activate faster. And to complement this, there is now no limit to how many times Sigrid can enter the Formation Breaker state during a stun. Now normally, this would allow you to enter Formation Breaker up to 2 times per stun since you only get a max of 2 Sigrid chain attacks per stun. However, this Mindscape is insane when paired with Norma since her bonus chains essentially bypasses that limit, allowing Sigrid to enter Formation Breaker up to 3 times consistently. And with her Mindscapes out of the way, let's talk about her possible Wenjins. Her Her signature gives 48% crit damage with its main stat. Aside from this, it also gives her a stack of the Battle Edge buff after the heavy attack of her basics or EX special hits an enemy, with each ability only being able to give one stack each. This buff gives 32% crit damage per stack and can stack up to 2 times for a total of a 64% crit damage buff. This buff lasts for a refreshable 25-second duration, so it'll pretty much last the whole battle. But once 2 stacks are active, she gains the Bone Chill buff, which allows her ice damage to ignore 20% of the enemy's ice res. Overall, this is a really strong Wenjin for improving Sigrid's damage. But the cool thing is, it gives her up to 112% crit damage, which is the highest crit damage bonus you can get from a Wenjin, and it's rather insane because her kit goes all in on giving her crit rate. And due to the amount of crit damage this Wenjin can give, it allows you to use an attack slot 4 instead of a crit damage one. But with that being said, her best budget S-rank alternative would be the Brimstone with its massive attack buff. The neat thing is, due to Sigrid using a lot of basic attacks, she can easily stack and maintain this Wenjin's buffs. This is also the best alternative to her signature, and can perform extremely close to it the more refinements you have on it. But just note, for double support teams where she tends to get oversaturated on attack, this Wenjin will give diminishing returns. Severed Innocence is also a pretty decent crit damage stat stick. It can give Sigrid up to 98% crit damage just with 2 stacks of its passive being consistently active. It is also important to use her normal special attack at least once every 30 seconds to maintain one of its stacks. As for A-rank alternatives, her best one is the usual Starlight Engine for its huge attack buff. It's pretty much just a weaker Brimstone, wherein Sigrid can easily get its attack buff through normal gameplay. Plus, it's a free-to-play craftable, so it's pretty easy to get. But with possible Wenjins out of the way, let's talk about drive discs. Her best general use set for teams not running Dial-In is weirdly enough Hormone Punk for its huge attack buff. However, its performance heavily depends on how well you're able to time its buff to the most crucial damage rotations such as stuns. So while this set has the potential to enable Sigrid to deal the most damage for non-Dial-In teams, it's definitely one of the more harder sets to use effectively. But a lot of Sigrid teams do switch in and out of her pretty often, which does make activating its buff during a stun so much easier. As for teams that run Dial-In, her best set would be Puffer Electro. First of all, its pen ratio buff is really good for buffing her overall damage, especially when you're pen ratio stacking with Rina or a pen slot 5. This is on top of it also giving an attack buff while buffing her ult, which deals a lot of damage. But thanks to Dial-In's bonus ults, you can actually take advantage of this set's buffs way more often. However, I would only recommend this set if you plan to use her with Dial-In, since it's extremely hard to take advantage of this set without her. Now, you can also use Dawn's Bloom for its massive basic attack damage buff, which is pretty good for buffing her held basic or basic attack spam. However, this does not buff her ult, chain attack, or EX special, which also deals a lot of overall damage. Which of course isn't ideal, and it's mainly why Hormone Punk or Puffer Electro with Dial-In has the potential to outperform it in current endgame. But again, that all depends on how well you can use those sets effectively. So with that being said, it is still a good set you can use, and it is the comfier option if you want to have longer rotations with Sigrid, since it has pretty much permanent uptime, or if you simply don't want to deal with Hormone Punk's buff timings, or don't have Dial-In for Puffer Electro. However, it's worth noting that current endgame content is giving a lot of damage percent buffs to Sigrid, on top of some supports and her kit also giving her some. So this set does currently give a lot of diminishing returns. But once those buffs do go away in future endgame content or for future stages without them, you can expect this set to perform better. And as a skill issue-ridden player, I do prefer this set since it is the easiest to use out of all of them, and I personally had the most success with it. Now for the 2-piece set, any of the sets on screen can work. But generally the best 2-piece would be a Puffer Electro, since pen ratio is a stat she really appreciates, especially if you're pen ratio stacking with a pen slot 5 or Rina. However, if you're using it as a 4-piece set, Any of the other sets can work. Just pick the one you need the most or the one that gives the least oversaturated stat for the content or team you're running.
But with our possible drive discs out of the way, let's talk about stats.
For main stats, for slot 6, attack is the best, which is usually the case for most attacker agents. As for slot 5, pen ratio is her best option. This is mainly because she can get a lot of attack due to a combination of Hormone Punk, her additional ability, and possible Wenjin and support options. While she already gets a lot of damage percent buffs due to the current endgame buffs, on top of some supports and her chain attack giving her quite a bit as well. This makes pen ratio better for buffing her overall damage across all her possible teams since every other stat is way easier to dilute. Plus, it's also really good for pen ratio stacking as I said earlier. Now, attack or ice damage percent can still work, but it depends on the scenario. For ice damage, it would highly depend on if you're running a damage buffer and which buffs endgame currently has. If future endgame stages doesn't have as much damage percent buffs, then ice damage does become an option. While for attack, it just really depends on how much attack Sigrid is currently getting. If she's not running an attack buffer, Hormone Punk, and an attack Wenjin, then attack percent does become an option. But honestly, even with the cases above, I would just stick with pen to save you the hassle of having to farm more pieces for her. While for slot 6, she doesn't really need crit rate since she already gets a lot of it. So her best option for general use would be crit damage, especially if you have terrible substat luck. However, attack is also an option if you already got a lot of crit damage from her teammates and other disc substats. This is especially the case if you also have her signature. Now for minimum stat priority, for crit rate, try to go for 100% crit rate in battle. Like I said earlier, just with her kit, base stat, and core level bonuses alone, she gets 85.4% crit rate, so getting to 100% crit rate in battle is extremely easy. Her core level up and base stats already give 19.4% crit rate, so in reality, you only need 14.6% from external sources to reach 100%. Out of battle, she needs 34% crit rate to reach 100% in battle. But moving on, as for attack, aim for a minimum of 3,000 and for crit damage, go for a minimum of 200. Now of course, this is a minimum stat recommendation, and since you'll mainly be focusing on crit damage and attack, you can most definitely get more than what's shown on screen.
With our stats out of the way, let's talk about possible teammates.
Now currently, Sigrid is best ran in a Hypercarry team with a support and a stunner, with her best partners being Suna for stun multiplier increases and Norma for more chain attacks. But if you have an M1 Rina, she's also pretty good and competitive in terms of performance, mainly due to her recent potential buff and the fact that Sigrid is best built with pen ratio, so pen stacking is super good with her. Now if you don't have her M1, she is still usable, but her buffs become harder to manage, so the team becomes harder to play, and she does also give a bit less pen ratio. However, the neat thing is, if you don't have the three of them, Sigrid does also have some pretty good alternatives that can enable her to still perform extremely well. For supports, Astra as usual is a great alternative to Suna, while Zhao is decent as usual for her attack and damage buffs. As for your budget option, you have Sokaku, which actually performed pretty well with her being able to score above 40k across all teams, which is mainly due to her ice-centric buffing utility on top of her huge attack buff. Her only issue is that her rotation can take a long time and can feel clunky to those not used to it, but thankfully her buffs have a pretty decent duration to compensate for this. As for stunners, there are quite a bit of options that can help Sigrid clear endgame content. Versus Dialin, who's OP as usual due to her buffs and ability to give Sigrid more ults, and she is the best alternative to Norma. Lighter finally gets another great teammate and can work well for his huge ice damage amping buffs. Plus, he's a really comfy stunner for longer Sigrid stun rotations due to his stun duration increases. While Yufufu also performed pretty decently if you want to play on a more on-field and less quick-swappy playstyle. But just note, I recommend Dawn's Bloom on Sigrid if you want to play her in this manner. And finally, the best budget option is actually Lycon, due to his ice-centric buffs on top of his stun multiplier increase, damage buff, and off-field stunning just being really good for enabling Sigrid. But if you're wondering how Dialyn compares to Norma, well, generally Norma is preferred over Dialyn since Sigrid gains several benefits from her chain on top of them dealing high damage while having a short duration, so it's perfect for triggering with Norma during stuns. So generally Norma should have an easier time outperforming Dialyn in Sigrid teams. However, if you can consistently get more meaningful stuns with Dialyn, she can still outperform Norma. But that's not something every player can do. So for comfort and for easier high scores, Norma is definitely preferred. And of course, this isn't discounting Dialyn since she's still a pretty good partner for Sigrid. It's also worth noting that you can run a double stunner setup with Lighter and Norma. And surprisingly, this team performed pretty well, being able to score almost 51k rather easily. This is primarily due to a few factors. First, similar to Hugo, Sigrid already gives herself a ton of attack from her passive on top of the attack from her possible Wenjin and disc options. So losing an attack buffer isn't too detrimental, especially when you consider the buffs from Lighter. But speaking of which, Lighter's buffs can compensate for the lack of a support, especially when combined with Norma's high damage and Sigrid's naturally high stat total. And finally, these teams can result in way more stuns compared to normal teams, which of course is great for overall damage output. So yes, this team is pretty viable if you want to try something new or unique, or if you simply want to torment Hugo by taking his best team. But I personally wouldn't run a double stunner team without these two though. But moving on, you always have the option of running a duo support team with any of the supports I mentioned. And surprisingly, these teams actually manage to perform well, with some of them, mainly the Suna ones, even competing with the teams with stunners in terms of performance. But this is mainly because of the boss. The normal Deadly Assault Butcher provides so much opportunities for defensive assists, which still allows for most of these teams to still get a decent amount of stuns, especially the ones with Suna due to her pretty good days building. And as you can see based on these scores on screen, the best units for these team are Suna and Rina. But Zhao and Astra are pretty good as well for clearing most Ice Week endgame content with no problem. The only real teams that underperformed were most of the Sokaku ones, cause Sokaku is kinda clunky. And the Rina Astra team, but that team in particular had difficulties triggering defensive assist due to Rina's evasive assist and Astra's mechanics. Now these teams are mainly focused on on-fielding Sigrid, so a majority of the field time goes to her, with the occasional quick swapping for buff refreshes and defensive assists. But because of this, I highly recommend using Dawn's Bloom on Sigrid for the team, since it's the only set out of her 3 possible sets that caters to long on-field rotations due to its high uptime. And it's also worth noting that a pen slot 5 and 2-piece is a must in this team due to all the oversaturated damage and attack buffs this team can give Sigrid. Now finally, here are all my Deadly Assault scores against the Butcher. Just note all S ranks were at M0, while all A ranks were at M6, and each agent had their best in slot Wenjin. And the scores you see here are heavily subjected to my skill issue, so depending on your skill level, level of investment, or setup you're running, you may get different scores. However, these should still give a good idea on how each team compares to each other. But that's about it. Personally, I'm definitely gonna be rolling for her because she's a very goofy and funny Uma Musume. I can't wait to see her horse around. But anyway, make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub.